Today on CityCast Nashville, we're joined once again by Brina Ratangi, editorial director of the Vanderbilt Hustler, to discuss how the Trump administration's proposed federal funding cuts could impact Vanderbilt University and the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. We also discuss student deportations, the threat of ICE on campus, and First Amendment rights. It's Monday, March 31st. I'm your host, Marie Cecile Anderson, and this is what Nashville's talking about. So last time we had you on, we were talking about how the affirmative action ban impacted Vanderbilt, but now we turn our attention to the federal funding cuts. So in January, the Trump administration moved to freeze billions of dollars in federal research money doled out by the National Institutes of Health to cut funding for indirect costs. What are the potential effects of these cuts for Vanderbilt University and Vanderbilt University Medical Center?
I think to start off, just want to provide some clarity on kind of what the NIH cuts really look like, what that means for our institution. So essentially, there's these direct costs, which are associated with grants researchers get from the NIH. That goes to actual research being done. And then the indirect costs are all of the administrative support, electricity, keeping the lights on, keeping the people monitoring the specimen in labs and that sort of thing. And so really we say direct and indirect, but together they're both incredibly essential for the work being done to kind of come up with cures and treatments for some of these diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. And Vanderbilt in particular, and other universities, they all negotiate their own kind of rates for these indirect costs. And our rate prior to some of the recent changes was at between 50% to 75%. So something very high. And that just meant that a lot of costs and everything were going towards some of these indirect administrative costs and all of that. And so now what this proposed policy, that there's since been a lawsuit, one of our administrators at Vanderbilt served as a declarant in the lawsuit, is to essentially reduce that indirect cost limit to 15%. So from, 50, 70%, some universities, including ours, some universities 30%, but really reduce it down to 15 and that being a hard cap. Realistically, this is not feasible. If a lot of universities are to reduce their spending to abide by this proposed cap, that would essentially result in the closure of many projects because it's just the way that the finances work out. It's not necessarily feasible to do that. And so that holds significant repercussions for Vanderbilt and the medical center as well.
Can you give us an idea of how much money we're talking about here?
It depends on the particular grant, I will say that, but
okay. We're
really thinking in terms of the millions here. And our provost Cybelle Raver, when she was a declarant on the lawsuit, she had this 10, 15-page document explaining its effects on Vanderbilt and VUMC. And there we were in the tens and some of it hundreds of millions.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot of funding being cut then. So you mentioned Alzheimer's, but what other research areas or projects are most vulnerable to these funding reductions?
When we think about the NIH grants and that indirect cost cap, that's really all biomedical research. But we've seen separately that there's been some targeting specifically work and research in the space of the social determinants of health, looking at gender, race, a lot of those kind of buzzwords that have been flagged by the new administration. And so, for example, there was a Senate committee that's led by Senator Ted Cruz, and they went in and kind of flagged different grants and funding from the National Science Foundation, the NSF, that they believed was promoting far left ideology, they called it. And so kind of across universities, anywhere from a couple million to many more million was flagged as, promoting this ideology. And so at Vanderbilt, that was about $4.9 million. But when you actually look at the grants that it is flagging, yes, some of them are about access and disability and belonging in STEM for students. But then others are, strictly like in the realm of chemistry and like material science. But then perhaps the professor listed on the grant was involved in trying to do outreach to communities in Nashville or whatever that might be. And so that also got flagged. And so it's really interesting when you look at what's been flagged specifically by that Senate investigation. Some of them, you understand why they were flagged. Obviously, I don't agree with the idea of like picking and choosing what research projects we continue and what we don't. But others seem so unrelated at all to all that's been going on. It almost seems like there wasn't that much careful oversight of what even was being chosen, kind of just this blanket sweep of anything that they thought could potentially be related to this being kind of flagged. And notably, that hasn't yet been affected. It's more so, I think, part of this tactic of raising like red flags and sirens. But at least on the NIH side, that's been blocked by a judge. And for this NSF funding, it's more so just the point of like raising attention, not necessarily stopping funds.
So something so blanketed like that it just seems so ignorant to me.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one way of putting it.
I might get in trouble for saying that.
No. To me, it feels like there's this almost war going on with higher education and academia and the kind of current political powers that be. And I think in that kind of battle against one another, really more like one side against the other, it feels like they're trying to gather together whatever it is that they can use as like almost a threat. Because I will say, like, if we think about some of the language regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, that was on a lot of like universities and medical centers' websites, Vanderbilt Medical Center actually removed all of that like terminology from their websites and social media, but almost preemptively. Like there hadn't actually been like clear verbatim instructions from any executive orders to get rid of that language. It was more so loose language on these executive orders that I think they may have overinterpreted or maybe preemptively interpreted as a sign of, oh, if we do this now, maybe we won't
They'll lay off.
Maybe we won't be as like scrutinized, And I think speaking for Vanderbilt compared to other universities we've seen in the news recently, I don't think we're being as scrutinized. I think also we haven't necessarily been in the news over the past year or two as much as, say, Columbia or Harvard or other schools. And so I think that there's kind of this tension going on among a lot of institutions, just saying, like, what do we do? Do we act now? Do we wait for someone to like specifically tell us this needs to be changed in this certain period of time? And I think shortly after they removed all of that language, then there was a Department of Education memo saying, please do X, Y, and Z within like 14 days or whatever it was. And so you kind of see this dancing around of, do I wait till it's enforced? Do I do it preemptively? What do these kind of vague orders even mean? So it's kind of challenging.
So people are reacting to the potential threats, not necessarily even actual cuts yet.
Yes.
Do you get the sense, do people seem scared to you?
I think it depends on the like demographic we're talking about. I would say people are scared in different ways. Like I think a lot of students are worried for their career prospects. I know countless students that are wanted to go into various like federal jobs, wanted to go into like CDC, NIH, like internships that have since been canceled. So they're kind of in this period of uncertainty. Like when they left high school, it was the COVID pandemic, all this uncertainty, and now they're leaving college and it's this new kind of level of uncertainty.
Breaks. Right.
Yeah. And so it's challenging. A lot of people who had jobs and internships lined up post-grad are now struggling to find something else. A lot of students who maybe are applying to medical school but take a gap year to do a research position, earn some money to be able to pay for medical school, those positions are being canceled. Even graduate students, we have at least one at Vanderbilt who was admitted for this upcoming year, and then they had to rescind some offers. So really, for the student perspective, like that's just a lot of uncertainty there. And I would say on the faculty side, there's a lot of fear as well, because for those people with research topics that have been flagged, that are in the news, this is, threatening their work, their careers, their livelihood, and also their ability to like hire kind of emerging students and trainees that would be the future of these fields.
So what happens to these labs that these people have spent their lifetime work in?
I think it's important to note that like federal funding, while a large part of funding, is not the only source. So there is still hope in terms of private funding, private foundations, a lot of like increased collaboration between universities. That said, like even some private funders are appearing to be affected. Like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, they changed some of their wording and canceled a grant for like STEM education. And that one didn't necessarily make a lot of sense to people because they are privately run. But I think that also goes to show the links between private and federal or private and public sector initiatives. So we can't really say for sure, but I think that this is a time for a lot of like creativity, adaptability, and figuring out, like this isn't the first time necessarily that such research and everything has been challenged. And so I think over these next few years, just figuring out how people can still continue this critical work, even amid all these challenges. And for example, like even in the courts, we see that the NIH kind of indirect cost cap was blocked. I don't believe it's yet been like permanently blocked, but at least temporarily. And we see a lot of universities kind of mobilizing to speak out against things that affect them. I would just say like, leveraging that collective power and speaking up when these issues are very clearly presenting a threat is vital.
We're back with Brina Ratangi, a student journalist at Vanderbilt, talking about how federal cuts and the threat of cuts is impacting that university. Brina, is this affecting graduate student enrollment?
They temporarily paused graduate program admissions just to gauge kind of capacity, funding, all of that. Then they resumed them shortly after. But I know other universities have also like paused for a more extended period of time. I think here, in terms of enrollment, not necessarily, but more so students that have applied, some of them have had their offers rescinded. And then also they've changed the capacity of some programs. So let's say a few programs in one school may be like significantly reducing or completely seizing admissions in order to allot kind of funding for other programs. And so now you have this issue of where do we allocate the resources? What programs are we prioritizing? So that's very challenging in and of itself because you can't really assign merit to different fields. Like they're all important. They all have people who've spent their careers kind of in these fields doing research, and it's just a very difficult time, I'd say.
So I'd like to talk about Columbia University, actually, and how Vanderbilt's reacting to the news out of Columbia and other big universities that international students are being picked up and deported by ICE due to their involvement in campus protests. Can you tell us about that?
I think what we're seeing at Columbia is very scary. Just this idea of students having this right to express their speech, their right to protest for causes that they believe in. And I think the fact that like that's gained a lot of attention in the news has definitely been felt on campus. I will say that Vanderbilt, though, is different in the sense that we did have some protests and some students involved in those last year. A few of them were expelled, some were suspended. And so I think like Vanderbilt took this very strong disciplinary action almost before all of this already is now going on. And so in the sense of Columbia, maybe, putting students on probation, but then like keeping them around, now ICE and the federal government are kind of going after those students. In our case, it seems that our university kind of laid down preemptively like repercussions for those students. And so I wouldn't say there's necessarily a significantly sized body on campus that would be at risk or at threat of any of that. But we have also heard, reports of ICE at least being in Nashville. And speaking for like students on campus, our university has reached out to students saying like, here's what to do. And also to faculty, like, here's what to do if ICE were to show up, contact our Vanderbilt University Police Department. So I think they've been clear on kind of the next steps should something like that happen. But also I don't foresee us, and knock on wood, reaching the same level of like national attention as Columbia, just because of the way in which the protests were handled differently here. And also the fact that Vanderbilt, compared to Columbia, is like not as activist of a campus. I think like historically we've had our pockets of activism, but maybe on the whole not been what you would see at maybe Berkeley or Columbia or Harvard. I think our like geography in the South as well contributes to some of that, like sweeping under the radar, essentially, when it comes to all of this.
Well, I just read this morning before we got on this call, the op-ed in Vanderbilt Hustler calling for Vanderbilt to block ICE from the campus. Do you think that's a pervasive opinion? Would anyone on campus welcome ICE?
I don't think anyone would welcome ICE. I think on the administrative level, they're very committed to complying with whatever it is federal orders deem and like working with federal agencies. But I think at least among students, whether students are, citizens of the country or on visas or whatever it is, like I think there's a general sense of unease when it comes to ICE and being on campus, just like knowing kind of historically and in recent years, like what has been going on there. And I will say, like, Vanderbilt's researchers and our like university are also very connected to the broader Nashville community. There are like refugees here, immigrants that we work with and work on in different projects. And so I think there's also some kind of tangential fears that even if they're not on campus, like the fact that they are in the city is kind of threatening in and of itself.
Vanderbilt is famously home of the John Siegenthaler First Amendment Center. How is all this affecting the way students feel about free speech and other First Amendment rights on campus?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we have this initiative on campus called Dialogue Vanderbilt, and that's kind of been the university, like kind of through the chancellor's office, like way of promoting like free speech, free expression, really like engaging with students. And I think they've continued their programming, but there almost seems to be a bit of a disconnect between some of the programming that's going on within that initiative, and I think some of the questions people have surrounding all of the uncertainty on the federal level right now, and I guess how that trickles down to us as states and cities. I will say, like, the university, especially our chancellor, have very much promoted this idea of free speech and expression. Like, that's been something that has really been core to the university's mission and values. But I do think that maybe students don't necessarily see their like free speech and free expression rights necessarily being like respected and uplifted. And I think that not necessarily even from now, but maybe stems from some of the protests and activism of last year.
Have there been any protests this year so far? Or maybe even since Trump took office?
So not on campus. There was like a rally for science and research in downtown that students participated in. We had a controversial speaker on campus recently that I think students did a little like mini protest for, like they handed out pamphlets.
Who was that?
Jonathan Greenblatt, I believe he's the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. But that's like, he's been on campus, I believe on Zoom before. So it was like a Zoom presentation, and they also protested last year. So that one is not necessarily changed by the current administration, just because I think that students would protest that regardless. But yeah, I would say just because of how our university, like we've discussed earlier, preemptively handled some of the like disciplinary repercussions last year, especially like compared to other universities, which maybe did put students on probation, but didn't necessarily expel them. I think like expulsion is a very severe act, right? I think there's been students, at least on the upperclassmen end, that have maybe not felt that same culture of expression and speech that the university is claiming to promote. So there's almost this distinction between speech and expression in reality versus speech and expression in this like hypothetical, sense of here's how we practice dialogue, but then it's not actually translating to dialogue in the moment about real issues.
What does it feel like to be a journalist right now?
I think I will say that Vanderbilt is really accommodating, supportive when it comes to our work. We've been, reaching out to them for a lot of different matters in the past couple weeks, and they've really done their best to provide us with the information that we need. They're obviously, it's hard to find the right person to go to, because if you go to, say, the dean of the graduate school, they say, oh, it's up to individual schools now, so you have to go to the school's deans, and you go to them and they're like, oh, I'm not sure what we can say, or we ourselves don't know. So it's more so just navigating how to report on this when the people who would be the experts in any other circumstance are also just dealing with the shock of all of this. So it's difficult to figure out what's going on, because things are also changing on the daily, and the people who are being affected don't even know yet how they are going to be affected.
Well, I just have to say, I've added the Vanderbilt Hustler to my morning ritual of reading of news, and you have been doing such an amazing job. And I really encourage our listeners to add the Vanderbilt Hustler to their morning coffee routine and news check-in, because it really does give you a sense of what's happening locally. And I think that's so important. Last time you were here, you talked about how important Vanderbilt's cultural richness was to you. Now that concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion have put entire programs at risk, can we get you to give us a gut check on how you're feeling about where you go to school right now?
I think there's this misunderstanding that without the words like diversity, equity, inclusion, you lose all of the programming and sentiment surrounding it. And while I do feel like those terms do help create an established space for such work, I don't think that the lack of these terms is necessarily going to stop that work, if that makes sense. Maybe professors are more restricted on what they can do, administration is more restricted on what they can do, but students are still very powerful agents of change in their own right. And I think at least seeing the cultural celebrations that have happened, that are going to happen, I don't think that students are going to let this kind of deter them from all that we've learned over the past 5 years and all that students care about, are committed to. And so it still gives me hope that this is happening, but at least the large majority of people understand that this is temporary, hopefully, and that, just as things can be undone, they can be done again. And so even though it is a challenge and a setback, I don't think that the work itself is necessarily going to disappear. It's just going to adapt to different formats. And I'm hopeful and excited to kind of be part of that as well.
That is a great answer. That does give me hope. So thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And we look forward to having you back on CityCast Nashville again soon.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Nashville. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell your friends? Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Nashville newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Toodles!